I'm going to introduce in the order in which people will speak, and I'm beginning with my friend John Gannon on the right. John has got a 35-year plus career in and around intelligence, including service as the chairman of the National Intelligence Council and the director of the analytical portion of the CIA. To his left, my immediate right, is Caryn Wagner, again, another longtime veteran of the intelligence community and oversight, including time on the Hill. Most recently, she was Undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security for Intelligence and Analysis. And the third speaker, Chris Kojm, to my left, is the current chairman of the National Intelligence Council. A lot of experience on the Hill and in the State Department, and has been the chairman of the NIC for the last 5 years. The NIC chairmen here represent a significant percentage of all there have been since the NIC was established. So I'm quite thrilled to be here with colleagues and with Caryn, who worked with me at the ODNI. Let me frame the issue so it'll be easier for John, Caryn, and Chris to plug in with a specific subject I've asked them to address. Transnational threats is a subset of national security threats that is almost congruent with the total. One can think about threats that are not transnational, but in the 21st century, that's the exception. Most of the issues that concern us are inherently transnational or have acquired a transnational dimension because of communications, because of ease of transportation, and so on. Transnational threats is a category that still subsumes what we would call traditional threats to national security. Military threats, efforts at subversion, efforts at counterintelligence, and the like, the things that countries have been concerned about, including the United States, from the earliest days, and for which much of our existing national security infrastructure and intelligence support to that infrastructure were tailored. They were designed to meet traditional threats, but have been asked to take on increasing numbers of non-traditional threats. I'll elaborate in a little bit, but after making the general point that the category of national security concerns is much, much broader than it was even 2 decades ago. It includes a lot more developments, a lot more issues, a lot more problems, and a lot more customers inside the United States, customers who expect intelligence support to help them to understand murky situations. The second aspect of the change in the character of national security threats is a transition over the last, I dated 2.5 decades, from threats to the existence of our nation, our way of life, existential threats, the Soviet nuclear threat, the ideological challenge of international communism, an alternative approach to economics, to something that comes very much closer to protection of the safety of all Americans everywhere, all the time, from all conceivable threats to their interest and safety and security. A very, very momentous shift of emphasis. Let me illustrate what I mean by expansion of the definition of transnational threats. Yesterday afternoon, we devoted time and attention to terrorism, the marquee issue of the last decade. It also includes another oldie but goodie, illicit narcotics. Counterproliferation, efforts to stop the spread of technologies and materials that can contribute to weapons of mass destruction. The newer ones, though, include such things as fake pharmaceuticals. The estimate is that roughly 50% of all pharmaceuticals floating around the international marketplace are fake. The good ones merely do nothing. The bad ones are dangerous. Trafficking in persons, women for sexual exploitation, children for labor, illegal aliens being brought into countries in order to avoid controls on migration and the like. Theft of intellectual property, which is considered to be a danger to national interest as well as the interest of the companies and individuals involved. Infectious disease, a disease that arises somewhere outside the United States and can come into the country and then become a public health problem. The common characteristic of transnational threats is that they originate abroad, or they're based abroad, or they take on a particular character outside of the United States, but then they become a border security problem as the threat, or however it is manifest, enters the United States or connects to the American component of it inside the states. And then once here, it becomes a law enforcement problem, a domestic concern. It's that end-to-end character that the intelligence reform legislation of 2004 attempted to get at, that raised many, many new challenges for everyone working with the issue. The final point I'll make in framing it derives from this idea yesterday characterized correctly by Ben Powell as national intelligence. That Caryn asked a question about this. Managing the transition from foreign intelligence to domestic law enforcement, from federal to state and local, requires crossing many boundaries. Geographic boundaries, bureaucratic boundaries, legal boundaries, different regulations that make the task extremely complicated, and in some aspects still involve driving off the map or driving ahead of the headlights, having to figure it out as one goes along. With that as the introduction, I'm going to turn the program over first to John, who I've asked to speak about sharing information internationally, working across this divide. Caryn to address some of the challenges of working with local, state, tribal jurisdictions and with the private sector. And Chris to speak on challenges of presenting the information to decision makers with caveats about what it does and doesn't enable us to say. With that, John, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's great to be here. Great to be working with the people on this panel again. Let me just make a couple general statements about collaboration, and traditional collaboration that really characterized most of my career in intelligence. And I will point out I've been retired for 10 years, although I've worked with the intelligence community in different ways since then. I'd like to talk about why I think it's different today. What are the drivers today that I think are pushing it to more collaboration? And then what does the future look like with regard to collaboration? And basically, my point is that intelligence is almost by definition a collaborative enterprise. Always has been. If you go back to the days of Moses, if you wanted to get information about one tribe, you went to another tribe to try to incentivize the sharing of information in a kind of barter trade, a way to increase your advantage. If you wanted to go directly at the tribe you were worried about, you developed strategies to steal that information. But collaboration for much of my career really was about a barter trade relationship where you had to have trust with your interlocutor in order to trade information. You all know certainly about the Five Eyes of of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. A very special relationship that we had with them, partly because of shared values as well as shared interests in the world. But we also learned to share information where there were shared interests and not necessarily shared values. We got more flexible as the years went along. But I would say that for most of my career, collaboration was principally a bilateral business. Multilateral sharing comes later and is more difficult to achieve. Still, I think, a challenge to us, even though I think in recent years we have been sharing more with multilateral institutions like the United Nations, European Union, and NATO, certainly. Difference today is that we've experienced, I think Tom sort of alluded to this in the past, I think it really goes back 30 years, to three what I call revolutionary movements. Was geopolitically, that the Soviet Union was swept away, and a lot of well, not a lot of them, literally all of the countries of the Warsaw Pact, their regimes collapsed, and what had been closed societies opened up. There was much more information to be had and to be shared. And then, of course, that is coupled with the technology revolution, what I call the death of distance, which I've discovered occurs everywhere in the world except on this campus, by the way. Technology really, when I started my career as a Latin American analyst, if I wanted a newspaper, I patiently waited for somebody to send it in a pouch for a week. Well, today, anybody who wakes up in the morning in an intelligence agency has the newspapers from any country in the world at their disposal, in many cases before the people in the countries of interest wake up and read. The volume of information now that has to be dealt with by the intelligence community, the velocity of that information would not have been dreamed of when I started my career. All that has to be managed and dealt with, and the risk associated with sharing the most sensitive parts of that information with allies and friends. The third revolution really relates to Homeland Security, and I think we have known, and it really goes back to the 90s, and I think we became very clear with the Hart-Rudman Commission and the Gilmore Commission that one of the deaths of distances was between foreign and domestic. And if you go back to the National Security Act of 1947, there's a very clear, almost religious definition of foreign intelligence versus domestic. Well, suddenly we discovered that information revolution that I've talked about is breaking down borders. Information is being shared, and also with regard to technology, we've got a technology revolution that doesn't just affect information in the way it's being shared, but information in biotechnology, DNA, for example, today, nanotechnology, neuroscience, and robotics. All these technological developments that have military and intelligence implications, and where information can be shared and acquired, certainly for our interests, are all out there to the good of mankind, but also to the bad of mankind when they are in the wrong hands. And one of the challenges that we have faced, and why these issues, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, as you may recall, there was a call for a peace dividend, and we started to surface these issues that we were worried about, and some thought that it was just an effort to keep the budget rolling. But really what it was a recognition that when you take these scientific developments, the new issues, that some of the issues that Tom mentioned, with regard to trafficking of women and children, for example, our adversaries had a technological capability to push their cause much more aggressively than in the past. So the challenge was significant and greater with regard to technology. When you put all this together, what does it mean for tomorrow? I think that, first of all, that clearly we're going to continue to be a collaboration-driven enterprise, more so than ever. If you're going to deal with the complicated issues that we have to deal with, and cyber probably is the principal one. This is a global issue that is literally border-free with regard to the challenge and the threat that we're faced with. For weapons of mass destruction, narcotics, organized crime, a range of transnational issues that now coupled with the technology revolution, challenges as we've never been challenged before. And then the Homeland Security, as I said, this has introduced a whole new set of demandeurs of intelligence, state and local governments and tribal and first responders who actually have a legitimate demand to have intelligence in order to perform the security functions that we have set out for them. So for tomorrow, closer collaboration clearly. I think one of the things that I hope that we'll be able to focus on more in the future in terms of collaboration is the intelligence-policy relationship. In fact, our policymakers and in the executive branch and the Congress establish priorities for intelligence, and they also should be a part of what we look at carefully in terms of improving our capabilities and removing some of the problems that we have as intelligence services. My own view has been too much focus on perhaps on the intelligence agencies themselves without those people who are setting our priorities and our requirements. I also think that broadening our information sharing isn't just about other countries or governments that we need to deal with, although that is part of it. Certainly the Five Eyes, in my judgment, are no longer adequate to deal with a challenge like the cyber threat. We've got to develop more kind of surgical approaches to information sharing where it's a clear advantage to us to work with other countries other than Five Eyes to take on these challenges. Also, sharing of information with the corporate world, with the scientific community. I continue to believe the intelligence community is behind the curve with regard to S&T, emerging disruptive technology developments, and the only way to deal with that really is to have relationships not only with countries but with networks, R&D networks that are developing capabilities that we should worry about. I think we are perhaps subject to technological surprise more than at any time in our history because of the distributed nature of R&D around the world today. I also think that a more surgical approach will have us working at times with adversaries. We even go so far as to say with working with the Chinese, for example, in those limited areas where there is a common interest for us to work together. We can do that today, and I think we should. Then the last thing I'll say is that as we look ahead, I know that the issue of the balance between security and our civil liberties and freedoms is often on the agenda. I will simply say my own belief is that security should exist to guarantee our freedoms, and that should always be the imperative that we follow. And I think for the most part, my colleagues in the agencies have always believed that. But what does concern me, and with regard to collaboration and every other aspect of the business, is the balance between secrecy and intelligence and security. And how much, and transparency too. So if you take, how much transparency can you have before you intrude on the essential secrecy you must have in order to succeed in the very difficult world of intelligence? And I think that is a real question for our democracy today, and one that I hope that we can perhaps deal with in this conference. Not for me.
Caryn?
Okay, thank you. Well, I will echo what was said earlier about how the transnational threats are basically two sort of overlapping circles these days, and also just add that not just have the threats evolved, but the view of what the intelligence community should be focusing on has evolved with them, because I think I recall from earlier a resistance in large swaths of the intelligence community to dealing with crime, that was not a national security issue, something that we shouldn't really be involved in. And of course, as crime itself has evolved to these increasingly global and sophisticated international crime networks, and the things that they are doing, like the fake pharmaceuticals and everything else, pose a larger and larger threat. That too has evolved, and so we now have an executive order that basically puts the intelligence community in the business of looking at select international crime networks. But there's still concern in the intelligence community that the unboundedness of that problem and the hugeness of it could kind of eat the community's lunch, if you will. But the other thing it does is it puts a real premium on us resolving these issues that I'm going to talk about and that have already been touched on, of how do you bridge that national security intelligence world with the law enforcement world, the kinds of data that Julia was talking about earlier, the personal information, law enforcement data that reside in unclassified databases, and how do you put those together to work the problem. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So since the threats have evolved to be transnational threats, the one we obviously have focused on for the last decade, as Tom said, is counterterrorism. And I would say that in the counterterrorism arena, we actually accomplished a lot. We did a lot of good things, and we did some things not so well. And I'll start with the good things. We did, in fact, succeed in pretty short order in bridging a lot of the communication gaps between agencies within the intelligence community. And then we took, which is, it's not perfect because nothing's perfect, but there's no malice anymore. If anything is not shared now, it's because of an accident, a problem, an oversight, not because anyone's saying, I don't think they need to have this information over at this three-letter agency. So that's huge, and we've come up with better policies and mechanisms to make that work. Then we started the harder and still unfinished business of trying to build the partnership, the enterprise, if you will, with the non-intelligence elements of the Homeland Security enterprise, state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement, and the private sector. And that is a particularly challenging realm. And also, I might add, the other, the operational components of the Department of Homeland Security, who are not within the intelligence community per se, are not governed by Title 50, but have huge amounts of data that is extremely important to working the terrorism problem. And I would submit also important to working some of these other transnational problems once we come to sort of a consensus on how we think we should do that in a way that's legal and appropriate. So I will just give a very small example of one of the challenges that we faced in trying to sort of collide these law enforcement and intelligence cultures and, more importantly, the data. And we were talking about upstream and downstream controls. The world I lived in Homeland Security was full of downstream controls, governed by the Privacy Act and systems of records notices about what we were going to do with data we had collected for legitimate purposes at the border or at airports or for immigration, and figuring out how to legally and appropriately share that information with the intelligence community while at the same time safeguarding the privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties of the people on whom that data was. That was not an easy task. And those legal regimes are not particularly amenable to just throwing all that data in a pot and seeing what you can do with it, which probably makes everybody here happy. But one of the things that happened was we realized that we had offered select people out at the National Counterterrorism Center access to a CBP database, which they needed, and which was, the data was allowed to be accessed by national security personnel. Well, what we realized was that there was a subset of data in that database that was not authorized for access by national security personnel. When the law, the Violence Against Women Act, was passed, the exemption was only for law enforcement, not for national security. So once we realized that, we had to say, okay, you no longer can have access to this huge set of data, 99.9% of which you're actually authorized to access, because this is an old database and we have no way of protecting that protected set of data within it. So we then had to go come up with extraordinary measures reviewed at all levels by lawyers to make sure that the appropriate data could be accessed, and then we pursued a legal solution on the Hill. But that's one example of how hard it is to work together across these boundaries, and we have a lot more work to do there. So anyway, we've made a lot of progress in the CT realm. No one's perfect, but I think we accomplished a lot. The area where I do think we failed, and we probably will have more conversation about this, is I think we did not realize in the intelligence community until I went to DHS, I didn't realize as an intelligence professional that we were kind of living in our own little bubble about how the public felt about what we were doing. And I don't think we have that luxury anymore. We have to do a better job of communicating, educating, having a dialogue on what's the contract that we want to have about the kinds of things we're doing, particularly in the domestic sphere, and things that impinge on U.S. citizens, because the point was made earlier, without some level of trust, that's going to be bad for the IC over time and bad for our nation. So we accomplished a lot. There's some things that I think we could adapt and evolve to the evolving transnational threats, but we still have work to do that in a way that is transparent and acceptable. So now that we're 10 years after 9/11, and we're starting to look around and say there are missions other than counterterrorism. How can we do them better as we evolve? What parts of what we've done in the CT realm, can we adapt? And I do think we can build on a lot of these things, but we have to be thinking about the kinds of information that we would want from state and local law enforcement and places like ICE in the Department of Homeland Security. They have a huge intellectual property center that's doing a lot of really interesting stuff. But again, we have these data issues of how do we exchange that, and even more importantly, we have cultural issues. They're not part of the intelligence community. They don't talk to the right people. We haven't built those networks and procedures so that we can work together, again, in a way that's legal and appropriate, and we need to do that. And I do believe that there are ways we can do that and have that dialogue with the public about what we're doing, but we haven't really focused on that, because the one point that I did want to make is I think the even bigger problem that we have goes back to the definition of national intelligence, and what does that really mean, and what do we expect the DNI, and not just the DNI personally, but his staff to be doing in the realm of trying to orchestrate, reconcile, integrate, and conduct oversight of the intelligence activities that are in the homeland and those that are the more traditional foreign intelligence efforts. Because we have, since the IRTPA, Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act was passed, we haven't really made a lot of changes in the way that we conduct business as an IC, particularly in terms of the DNI staff, which is providing sort of that umbrella oversight of the community. Part of that is cultural, because most of the people on the staff grew up like I did in the Title 50 intelligence world or the defense world. They haven't worked in, nor do they understand the law enforcement domestic side of the house, the different legal regimes, the different contract with the public, if you will, the fact that most information is unclassified and it's much more governed by the Privacy Act and those kinds of things. So the thing is, if you don't understand it and you've been told your whole career that if you do anything wrong with U.S. persons data, you're going to get in trouble, what you do is you just avoid the issue. And that's kind of what has happened. So what we don't really have is an overarching sort of look at what are we doing in the homeland? And we are doing quite a bit, legitimately and legally, with Title 50 resources, but nobody actually was owning that problem because we just kind of wanted to pretend it wasn't really happening. So DNI Clapper, who is the third, I think, DNI since the IRTPA was passed, has actually started to make some real steps in this arena. And we also talked about, yesterday Ben Powell talked about the revision of the Attorney General guidelines for the Bureau, which was a huge step that was taken under DNI McConnell. But we're now trying to look at, okay, how do we integrate these domestic pieces of the intelligence community more into the fabric of this so that the kinds of information they have that would be of use against transnational organized crime, against counterproliferation, against cybercrime, financial crime, huge amounts of information. How do we use that legally, and how do we make sure that people know, at least at the conceptual level, what we're doing, and we have established sort of that contract with the public that we need to have. So there are a few things that have happened. The National Intelligence Manager for the Western Hemisphere has now, the National Intelligence Managers are sort of the integrators who are supposed to be looking at topics and functions and making sure that all the parts of the intelligence community are working together to answer the biggest questions in those areas. No one was responsible for anything that was happening in the homeland. Not that we're doing espionage on the homeland, but there are intelligence activities in the homeland that are collecting against foreign intelligence targets, counterintelligence targets, and legitimately by the FBI, terrorism targets in the homeland. who's looking at, are they doing the right things? Do we have the right level of resources? Are they conducting all their activities in accordance with intelligence oversight and the law? It really wasn't happening. So we do now at least have a national intelligence manager who's responsible for that. The DNI has created domestic DNI representatives that are double-hatted with FBI special agents in charge in 12 of the major urban areas in the country to provide a coordination function for Title 50 activities, which is good, except that I don't think they or anyone else really completely understand what it is they're supposed to be doing, which I find a little worrisome because I think that can easily be misinterpreted. So I think we have some work to do in clarifying what are they doing, and then again, how does their coordination function for Title 50 activities in the Homeland intersect with the state and local folks who are operating under different legal regimes. So, but these are steps in the right direction. But I still think that there's a lot that needs to be clarified in terms of how we deal with U.S. persons information, a lot of some of the data issues I talked about. And we also need to make sure that as we take those steps into defining what national intelligence means in the Homeland, what the DNI's role is in operationalizing that in the Homeland and integrating that with the foreign intelligence and counterintelligence activities, that we are communicating what we are doing in a way that does not make it look scary and that we can defend and ideally get support for. So and doing that under the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act is going to be very challenging. It's a very weak law. It was sort of lobbied against strongly by both DOD and DOJ when it was being crafted on the Hill because, neither department, it's classic Washington, neither department wanted their authorities or equities to be abrogated. So the DNI didn't get a lot of clout to go with this huge new definition, and how we figure out how we're going to operate in this future environment of transnational threats and big data. Still a lot of work to be done. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Caryn. Okay, thank you, Tom, and it's a real pleasure to be here with three colleagues with whom I've worked closely throughout my career, and in particular I want to thank John and Tom, my predecessors in my present position. They have been good friends and given me guidance, helping me to do the job I do today. So what I wanted to touch upon is briefly on transnational organized crime, building on the comments made. And then I will speak about communicating uncertainty and assessments of risk to decision makers, as Tom asked me to do. First on transnational organized crime. For the past 12, 13 years, our focus, quite properly, has been on terrorism, the preeminent transnational activity of national security concern. And as Caryn has said, and as the record shows, we've done well as a government, not without difficulties and challenges, and they are several. But the country has been protected. What I want to take a moment to talk about is transnational organized crime and the rapidly evolving threats to our country that are far more broad-based and diffuse and very difficult for our intelligence community to get on top of. Part of the reason it's hard to get on top of these is because we have had a very significant resource focus, appropriately, on terrorism. But because our resources are put on that threat, other threats don't get the attention they deserve. Well, why is transnational organized crime of such concern? As Caryn noted, the President put out a directive, it's 3 years ago now, directing the policy and intelligence community to devote more effort. The nature of the threat is we've moved from centralized hierarchical structures of transnational organized crime organizations to far more amorphous and highly adaptable networks. This has been informed, of course, by information technology and the collapse of distances, as John has mentioned. And these organizations aren't simply using phones anymore or emails. They have very sophisticated cyber technologies and ability to communicate securely on behalf of illicit activities. You know, in the Godfather movies, you think about guns and cash. Well, that world is different now. It's many other means of financial transaction involving global investments and all kinds of ability to transfer resources around the world in an instant. And the means of influence to secure outcomes is by corruption of governments. Transnational organized crime in many governments around the world has had very significant influence in undermining the authority and legitimacy of governments in the view of their own populations and giving them free rein to conduct their activities. And there is a linkage to the terrorism threat. These bad actors increasingly offer services. They are service providers, and sometimes on behalf of foreign terrorist organizations. As Tom noted at the outset, this involves a wide range of activities: money laundering, bribery, narcotics, one of the better known transnational threats to us, but it's counterfeited and pirated products, pharmaceuticals certainly, but all kinds of intellectual property, environmental crime, credit card fraud, and has been mentioned, human trafficking. So part of this is it's not simply very difficult to collect on this wide range of activities. What's really hard for us is to identify priorities. And in the traditional world of law enforcement, you would identify bad guys, arrest them, throw them into jail, and that would make a dent, or at least we thought it would. Well, that's not the case today. Organizations are highly distributed. You still can arrest people, but that doesn't solve a problem. And this is why intelligence is so important, merged and fused with law enforcement, to understand the structure of these organizations, what are the key points where government action and law enforcement activity can make a difference in thwarting these organizations. And therefore, intelligence in identifying priorities is quite important to us. I guess, based on what I've put forward to you, we have to state, and I guess it's a bit of a confession, that we just have huge collection and intelligence gaps as we deal with transnational organized crime. And to address them, we've got to work in lots of directions. As John Gannon mentioned, we need a lot of outreach to experts, financial, industry, academic leaders, specialists, because there's knowledge to help us address these concerns far beyond what the traditional definition of the intelligence community has collected. And it is a collaborative activity from the very get-go. We cannot make progress on transnational organized crime unless a whole host of agencies inside the intelligence community, across the United States government, and with state and local authorities work together. And I simply would add, with respect to this, that this also involves Defense Department elements, Northcom and Southcom. It involves the Coast Guard. It involves the Treasury Department, several elements of the Department of Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the State Department's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau. So a wide range of organizations. So let me turn now to what Tom had asked me to speak to a bit more, and let me finish with that. How do we communicate uncertainty to decision makers? I hope I've made clear to you that on these questions of transnational threats, there's an awful lot of uncertainty. Not simply collection gaps, but our ability to form analytic frameworks and analytic judgments about the information we have. So every assessment by the National Intelligence Council includes an explanation of estimative language. And by estimative language, we don't simply describe how events occurred and are occurring now, but we try to give assessments helpful to the policymaker. Where are events going? Well, since it's about the future, we can't speak with certainty. So we assess likelihood or probability of an event. And associated with our judgment about likelihood or probability, we also convey to the policymakers our levels of confidence that we ascribe to those judgments. And as we assess likelihood, we will state that we assess, we estimate, we judge. And as we speak to those judgments, we'll use words such as probably, likely, unlikely, remote, or at the other end of the spectrum, almost certainly, where we have the information to make a judgment with that level of certitude. We also attach to our judgments confidence levels: high confidence, moderate confidence, and low confidence. High confidence means we have a wide body of reporting from many sources. We have information that has been corroborated across those sources. And we, through the nature of these sources, have established their credibility over time. A moderate confidence judgment would mean that we have less reporting, some that has been corroborated but where questions remain, or where we have some significant uncertainties about gaps in our collection or judgments that we simply can't make because it's beyond our the information before us to state. A low confidence judgment would mean we have some reporting, scattered sources, not necessarily corroborated or not very much, and there's some question about the credibility of these sources. So the reforms that have led us to speak in probabilistic language and with respect to confidence judgments came about under Tom's tenure when he was Deputy Director for Analysis. And it was in the aftermath of not just 9/11, but the Iraq weapons of mass destruction estimates, where we as a community were challenged and obliged, obligated really, to improve our game and to adopt a more rigorous not only more rigorous analysis, but a more rigorous means of presentation to help our policy customers deal with uncertainty and to present information that conveyed what we knew or what we know, what we don't know, and then we can give our best judgment as well. So I think I'll stop there, turn it back to the chair, and thank you.
Thank you all for information-rich and within the allotted time presentations. Before opening up to questions, I'd like to underscore and link some of the points that have been made, because I think they are important for understanding this phenomenon. One, a point that John made particularly on the priorities and the guidelines affecting intelligence activity are set by policymakers. Intelligence is a support activity that the policymakers correctly decide how they want to allocate risk, what priorities to set, and what rules the intelligence community is to follow in pursuing those priorities. These have more theoretical clarity than practical applicability. As a collection priority, it makes a difference in where satellites look and how you align sign linguists and the like. But the fact of the matter is that intelligence is a free good for essentially every official in the United States security enterprise. And they feel entitled and empowered to ask for what they need. So the intelligence community is always pushed toward trying to do everything all the time to satisfy this very diverse group of officials. The policy setting exercise is particularly germane on transnational threats because it's not only U.S. government priority setting, it's also other governments, because that affects what's collected there, what can be shared with the United States. I am reminded of a visit from a delegation from an intelligence committee out of the EU early in my tenure as deputy DNI. And they wanted a streamlined, simplified, larger volume sharing of intelligence, the United States to the EU. And we talked at cross purposes for a long time before I decided the only way to deal with this was head on. I said the biggest impediment is that you all share intelligence with us as individual countries. And every one of you places restrictions on which of the other members of the EU we can share that with. That everybody spies on everybody, an increasing number of at least the prospective restrictions on how that will happen among other countries and citizen protection will affect the ease and the content of sharing with the U.S. on these transnational issues. It's not an intelligence community issue to decide, it's a policy issue. A second is this domestic and foreign transaction. Caryn pointed at some of those who grew up in a foreign intel world that don't understand the law enforcement and vice versa. I remember as we started getting topics that spanned the border, and as a career foreign intelligence guy, was not at all surprised when my people came to me and said, we can't deal with this stuff. It's got the names of Americans in it. You go to jail for that, get away from it. But a world in which if you don't have a name, how do you know who to watch and pick up? If you do hit a name, that puts it in, you can't use this. It's going to be redacted before you get there. So it makes the protection elements make it difficult. And others is different in expectations. The first product that crossed my desk after the designation of this new category of national intelligence happened to be on narcotics smuggling, illicit drug movements into and in the United States. And I got gorgeous maps with large arrows coming out of South and Central America, many through Mexico, showing the flow of narcotics, with explanations of how this was possible because of corrupt police department and bribe taking by more senior political officials. And it all stopped at the Rio Grande. And I said, how do drugs get to Chicago and Detroit and Washington? Well, we can't do that. That's a domestic. I said, we have to do that. This is now integrated. And it's the same logic that it's the corrupt police departments and politicians on the take. Is that what explains why we have drugs in Chicago and Peoria and other places? You can imagine the difficulty coming to grips with that. The final one has to do with a point Chris made on the nature of transnational crime. That there's no longer this vertically integrated system, or that those still exist somewhat. It's service providers. When I was at the State Department, INR, we referred to this as thugs are us. We do money laundering. We don't care if we do it for smuggled guns, for smuggled people, for drugs, for terrorists wanting to move money. That's what we do. Somebody else, we specialize in crossing borders. We specialize in knowing which customs officials will look the other way or already on the pad, which hotels won't report passport information. It makes it very much harder to detect and disrupt in this. With that, let me turn this over to you. What have we failed to address that brought you to this gathering? On what subjects would you like greater clarity? Or what do you want to tell us?
So I'm not sure if I heard you all correctly, but I do sense some frustration driven by the relative vacuum existing in sort of the post-Cold War environment in terms of framing the strategic posture that we face as a country. I'm not going to suggest, I mean, there would be some that might suggest this is driven by politics or the different administrations, but I put that aside. I think there's kind of a more fundamental question. So I have a background in international relations, and we sometimes pose this as kind of the state actor versus non-state actor problem. But as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering whether I should be convinced or not that that's a false dichotomy. And I wonder if you all have thought about that issue. So let's just take the Taliban. Arguably they're a classic non-state actor, but everyone knows that without the ISI they wouldn't exist, and that in some sense they're kind of a proxy for China's influence in that area of the world versus India. So that looks like a kind of classic state actor conflict. And the reason I think this is important is because I think what we seem to be all saying is that there's some uncertainty about how to prioritize. The complexity of the data issues you're facing are overwhelming. And so the resources available to solve those problems are inevitably limited. We only have one economist here, but she may want to help us comment on that. But so inevitably choices have to be made, and so if there isn't a sort of strategic picture here to drive the setting of priorities based in some, conception of how the world works and the U.S.'s role in the world today, then I'm wondering what how we're going to make those sorts of choices and how to frame the research and thinking that ought to go into framing solutions to those questions. I hope that's clear, but see what you can do with it.
Who wants to step up to that one?
Well, I'll say a word. This relates to some of the global trends work that the National Intelligence Council has done. Individuals are vastly empowered today compared to 10 years ago. They will be more so 10 years from now. The power of sovereign governments and their capability is less. The power of non-state actors across the board, whether it's the Taliban or corporations or charities or groups brought together by social media, is impressive and will grow over time. And simply the challenge that puts for policymakers and for the intelligence community is exponential. And any political leadership will have difficulty prioritizing issues just because there are so many, and each of them represents a threat to security and safety of American citizens and institutions. So I guess the short answer would be yes, I concur, and yes, the problem will get harder, and those of us in government will simply have to continue to wrestle with it as best we can, enhanced by those same information technology tools going forward that will help us with questions of big data.
If I could just add one thing, it is kind of a feedback loop, because we need, as the intelligence community, for the policymakers to be setting the priorities. I don't think anybody wants us to be setting our own priorities, but to a certain extent, we shape that by presenting sort of our understanding of the world based on our intelligence analysis. So that becomes the dialogue between the community and the policymaker. But then it goes back to something my colleague says as well, is that we need to make sure that that's not a closed loop, that we are soliciting views of academia, and other thinkers, because the stakes are pretty high in determining where you want to place that balance, and you want to make sure that you are you're presenting the decision landscape the best way you can.
I would just add, as a footnote, obviously the ISI-Taliban relationship is a transnational and national nexus. There, you have one with Hezbollah in Iran. But on issues like the cyber threat, organized crime, WMD proliferation, these really are transnational in the sense that to track these issues, and also their nexus with technology, both on the national and the transnational level, is a huge challenge to the community. But your comment reminded me once when I was with George Tenet testifying before a congressional committee, and a member listed a bunch of these technologies. And this was just before 9/11, by the way. And the member said, which one of these is the most important priority that we have? And George hesitated and said, I want you to tell me, of all these things you've listed here, what's the most important? And George very smartly said, well, sir, as the Director of Central Intelligence, if any of those things happens, I am going to be held accountable. So I cannot appropriate. On the way back in the car, he said, figure out which, get me a list. And by the way, I will confess that what I said, got back to him, was the top priority I saw was international terrorism, but likely an attack on facilities or U.S. interests abroad. I did not see, and this was months before 9/11, I did not see the attack coming to the homeland. But I would say, to your point, I think it's extremely difficult to prioritize. But I would also add that I think the lack of alignment between our executive branch and the legislative branch, I think, is a huge problem for the intelligence community. And I think we've seen a lot of that with regard to some of the NSA issues, where I think congressional oversight, there's a lot of it, but when an issue involves the public, there is a tendency to run from accountability like a scalded dog, and that is a problem, I think, for the intelligence community, which I think believes that it is following the guidance from Congress. And in terms of transparency, intelligence committees have access, and they can ask for access. They don't do it. So I think focusing on that, to me, the issue of the intelligence policy relationship between the executive branch and the intelligence committee, and then the Congress in there too, and getting that alignment, that is the only way you can really have priorities in a very complicated world, and that's extremely difficult to achieve in our distributed powers of our government.
I just had one sentence. One of my confirmation hearing appointments with John Cornyn, who was then senator from New Jersey. He said, I'm going to ask you a mean question. He said, what do you think about congressional oversight? I said, I wish I had some. And the specific follow-on was because there's so much money involved in intelligence work, and there are the civil liberties protection kind of issues, that's where the fiduciary efforts of the Congress focus, not on the quality of analytic product, which was my area. And I said, we have one customer, the United States government. We get interaction every day, good, bad, indifferent, but with the executive branch, but very little feedback. I said the only possible check on how well or badly we're addressing national priorities is you, and you don't do it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I am. I'm curious. I mean, I do feel like, especially with this presentation all about transnational crime, I think of the intelligence community as having a very truncated oversight because they had a very limited area where they could work, right? So it's just the intelligence committees. It's the secret court with only one side. The public accountability is very limited. I've been trying to get some for about 8 years. In the courts, in the regular open federal courts, and that's because the mission was supposed to be limited to foreign intelligence and non-U.S. persons. And what I'm hearing from everybody in this meeting is that now, we need to do domestic too. We need to come over to domestic, and so I guess I was wondering what you would think about some of the ideas we have about accountability over on the domestic side being applied to intelligence. And there was a paper written by Professor Ann Joseph O'Connell recently that suggests, actually I think this is 2008, that suggested that some of the APA ideas, American Administration Procedures Acts, about rulemaking, about notice and comment, about the ability to do challenges after the rules are done, and applying some of those to the intelligence communities as a way to try to bring in some of the checks and balances that we have in the domestic sphere, since you guys are all here now. So I just wanted, and I specifically, Ms. Wagner, because you raised this as an issue, your thoughts about that suggestion.
Well, I will say, first I want to correct the record. There's actually been 4 DNIs, not 3, so from my previous comments. But I know you knew that. But anyway, it's It's an interesting question. I don't know a lot about rulemaking. I'm very used to being in a large room full of people where I'm the only one without a law degree after all my time at DHS. So I'll just speak from the perspective of congressional oversight and accountability. Coming from DHS, where there is basically no congressional oversight, the one recommendation of the 9/11 Commission that was never acted upon in any way, even tenuously, was the recommendation to reform oversight of the department, which is spread among, I think, 36 different subcommittees. So there's that I find truly a problem, and that in and of itself doesn't solve the problem, though, because we still haven't addressed, okay, so maybe you fix oversight over here over Homeland activities. When I was the Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis, my budget was basically authorized and overseen by the intelligence committees because it was funded in the National Intelligence Program. So it wouldn't necessarily fix that problem. It's still something that I think needs to be addressed. The challenge of congressional oversight is a huge one. I don't know how to fix it. I worked up there for years. Part of the problem with the intelligence committees is they draw a certain group of people who are willing to sort of labor in obscurity because they're not allowed to do press releases and everything else on the work that they do in the committee. So you get either true believers or people who are trying to reform from the inside, but it tends to be a self-selected group. And I don't know that that's necessarily particularly helpful.
So if I may, and I feel like I didn't mean to blindside you because you don't know what the APA is, but the APA is about public notice and comment. It's not about congressional oversight.
Well,
it's about public ability to have basic outlines about what's going on with their communications and with their information, and having a notice. So when I say notice and comment, I apologize because I realized that you didn't realize that was what I was talking about. There are the Administrative Procedure Act is a way for the public to have input.
And I actually think that's something we should talk about, because we were talking earlier about the fact that we haven't done a good job in having a dialogue on what we're doing. Not that necessarily everything that we do has to be subject to an up or down vote by the American public, but I think that might be I don't know that I want to endorse that process because I don't know that much about it, but certainly some understanding way of communicating at a conceptual level the things that are happening. I'll get to you in just a second. Might be helpful. We talked about some other ways, this being one of them, communicating better with educational institutions, colleges and universities. I think none of us feel particularly happy or comfortable with using the press as our only way of communicating. That hasn't gone so well for us. So I think we'd be open, and I will ask my colleague to comment. So
I'll introduce myself as Elizabeth Grinscott-Parker with my hat on as a member of the Public Interest in Classification Board, where in fact we have tried to use a methodology somewhat like that. And I would have to say that while it's a very interesting idea, I don't think it's worked that well. We don't tend to get a whole lot of response, I don't think, as we had hoped about a topic that we feel is really central to what we're talking about today, and that is better access to information. And so we've come out with all these reports, and we've asked for public comment on prioritizing where they would like to see additional attention placed on declassification, a broken system, and we don't get much back. So, I think also suggestions here are useful, but there's no panacea.
I think we have to do a lot of different things, and it needs to be almost a campaign. We need to think about it. We really haven't, I think, in the intelligence community. I think we were very comfortable, particularly those of us who were sort of cold warriors, that the public trusted us to do the right thing to keep the country safe. And I think views have evolved, and we need to evolve with them. But I certainly don't have the answer, and I don't think there is one answer. So,
Yes, you understand?
Yeah, just a word. The question was really predicated on foreign intelligence and its compartmentation from the domestic world. and how do we deal with rules and procedures going forward. The thought I simply want to leave you with is that the events of 9/11 were emblematic of there is no difference between foreign and domestic, but the bigger point really is just the profound nature of globalization. All of you in education, in the sciences, the global supply chain, there is no human activity now that doesn't cross borders. And that's true with threats and the things that the intelligence community worries about. So we have a globalized system of threats where we need to work with international governments and with every domestic entity internal to the United States. And our system of oversight going forward, I think, has to take on that profound reality. And I'll leave it at that.
Could I just comment on the foreign domestic issue too? I think one of the problems we have on the domestic side is we simply don't have enough intelligence. So it's not an issue of people failing. It's that we don't have enough. How do we get a more robust domestic collection model? I came from CIA, where all of my colleagues were given the mission to go abroad and to get information, break any law abroad, to get information that could be characterized as a threat. Get enough information to put it into a threat assessment. On the domestic side, if you take FBI, for example, you have folks who are trained. There is a very strong culture that is very much committed to our Constitution and to embedded laws with regard to civil liberties. And they are trained historically to get information that can bring people to prosecution, criminal investigations. So if you ask somebody from CIA, could you please broaden your aperture and get information that will actually bring some of these people you're looking at to court, you would have had a freak show on your hands. But we are now, we ask FBI to broaden their aperture, so linger, and don't just look at the criminal information, but to broaden to the conspiracy, and then beyond that to any information that may relate to a general threat. So my point is, this is extremely hard to do. So when I look at models in terms of public discussion, what I like to say is don't think we're ever going to have a CIA model brought domestically, because believe me, you wouldn't like it. But for a domestic model, it seems to me, has to be a collaborative model, where the FBI can do what it does well, broaden the aperture, but you're going to have much greater cooperation with state, local, and local communities, really, to create that additional intelligence we need to protect people's and to guarantee their security. So it's hard. It's hard to do, and I think that message probably hasn't been made clear enough, including by our members of Congress, by the way, who are much more quick to criticize our agencies rather than to see the difficult path that they had laid out for them in order to change the way we do business. But on the domestic side, I think we are still 12 years after 9/11, we're still struggling, I think, to get a model that works, and that communicates, that shares information, and that really does maximize the extent to which we can protect the security of the American people.
My only addition to this discussion, and speaking only for myself, a 38-year veteran of the intelligence community, I have absolutely no problem with making public and subject to debate the rules under which the community does things. I mean, most of them originate in congressional guidance, and then there's the implementing guidelines. I think the public ought to know sort of where the lines are that the intelligence community colors up to, but my experience stays inside those lines. But what is permitted, what are the priorities, all of that I think could be a lot more transparent than it is. Sir.
Thanks. I have a brief question, mostly touching upon the issue of international cooperation that, well, I think all the speakers touched upon it at some point. I am a lawyer, so maybe my question might sound naive for you, but how does it work exactly? So, I mean, is it just, you talked about sharing of information. Is it just only sharing, or do you have at times moments when where you work together in liaison with other agents from elsewhere, and you do analysis together? That's my question. Do you craft analysis in liaison together with other countries? And then I have, so it's, I don't know if it's clear, but is it just sharing, pure sharing, or is it or is there something more? In that case, how do you match this with the political priorities that each agent has? Because of course that could be problematic at times.
So there has to be, as I said, a common interest, but there's no question that we share analysis regularly and also participate in joint operations with regard to organized crime, almost all the issues that I have. Certainly on cyber, more and more, it's vital that we're able to operate together as well as just to share information. It's going to be actionable information that helps us to do something about the threat.
You share analysis means, you share your threat assessment, or you do a threat assessment together with?
We actually have, in a number of ways. It's done iteratively. You can actually have regular meetings with analysts from one security service meeting with your analysts, and you have a conference just like this. On the other hand, you can have information that is based more on support for joint operations, for example, where the meetings are much more related to a specific project that you're working on.
I think he's trying to make the point there's a difference between sharing and joint collaboration.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But I'm saying we absolutely collaborate. There's no question on operations as well as on sharing information.
Yeah, the second part of my question was more or less, what are the impediments that you see when it comes, the main impediments that you see when it comes to cooperation? With regard to sharing on the one hand, and with regard to crafting or making analysis together. And I'd like to ask, if possible, to focus, since I come from the European Union, on the impediments in the cooperation with the European Union as an actor, not as a combination of states. Thanks.
Okay. I don't want to do all the talking.
I'll just make one comment, but it's a little dated, and then Chris may have more. I mean, one of the things that I participated in from a European perspective was the crafting of joint threat assessments for NATO. And that was a rather huge, cumbersome bureaucratic process, but it did result in sort of coordinated and agreed upon positions about the threat to the alliance, and they were done cooperatively by analysts from all the countries. So that was one huge example. Another example that gets maybe to your first question is when I was at DHS, we also did a joint threat assessment on the border jointly with CISEN in Mexico. And that we had a few more of the sort of political sensitivities there, because we were obviously more concerned about the drugs flowing north. They were more concerned about the weapons flowing south. And it served, I think it's fair to say, as many purposes other than just analytic to kind of get us together and build relationships and partnerships. So we do this frequently with a lot of different countries for a lot of different purposes, and sometimes the main benefit is not necessarily the findings and conclusions in the analysis. So
We are no longer intruding, or we are not going to intrude on somebody else's panel. We're intruding on your lunch. So I'm going to make, no, Bob.
Don't all leave at once.
Bob, you get the last word.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And this is kind of a summary question. I was sitting all during the whole panel thinking, what are the challenges that you face that we in the academic community could help with? That is, measures of uncertainty, the boundaries, threats, training people, and so forth. What's missing? What's really missing from, what might be done next?
Well, let me take a one shot at it. It has to do with the point Chris made about outreach, that the amount of knowledge, information, expertise required to deal with an enormous number of subjects exceeds the capacity of the intelligence community and should. We need a better mechanism for tapping that among outside experts, and outside experts, I believe could be more willing to engage with the goddamn intelligence community than is often the case. And you can't do that in crisis mode. That you have to develop these relationships and share. The intelligence community has to be forthcoming about the problems that it's worried about. It can share judgments. It doesn't have to share and can't share often the sources. But to tackle these complicated problems together rather than in an adversarial, and the academic community is, at a minimum, the second opinion on a lot of these things.
Yeah. Could I just say, I brought up the issue of the tension between secrecy and transparency. If you go back to the Eisenhower administration, probably the Eisenhower administration all the way up through to the Johnson administration, if you looked at the issue of transparency, you would find it was woefully in short order. And a lot of damage done to the way the intelligence community proceeded because it didn't have that transparency. Question today is, do we have too much? And how does it intrude on secrecy? And we're having to deal with that. But the fact is, for most of my career, the degree to which that we interacted with academia, with the corporate world, we benefited from it. We became better at what we did because we didn't have the expertise we needed inside the community. We didn't have the technology or know how to deal with emerging technologies in ways we could be helped from the outside. Also, and just frankly, on general management issues, including dealing with the cultural issues of the community. We got advice and programs that helped us from the outside. So there's just no question. There it is. The answer to your question is there are multifold ways that we can be helped, and I think that is an area of collaboration that we need to keep looking at more and more aggressively.
The number one contribution from the academic community, in my opinion, is doing what you do best. What now we do best, because I'm back in it, which is training people. That to fill the toolbox with the skills, the networking elements of now globalized education that the intelligence community could not even begin to duplicate that. I'm going to call this session to an end before the growling stomachs take over. Thank you for your attention. Again, thanks to the Journal for having us.